Hello, and welcome to episode 15, part 3 of KRAD COVID Readings, my attempt to ameliorate our horrible coronavirus nightmare by reading entertaining fiction. This week I've been doing the Dragon Precinct story, When the Magic Goes Away, in 5 installments. This is the 3rd installment. This is Danthres and Torin's first case, which takes place about 10 years prior to the main action of the Precinct series of fantasy police procedurals that started with Dragon Precinct and continues to 4 more novels, as well as the short story collection Tales from Dragon Precinct, which has this story in it. Here is When the Magic Goes Away, part 3. Newcastle. Bell Newcastle rubbed his jaw, trying to ignore the ache that cut through his mouth. He knew he should have gone to a healer, but it wasn't that bad at first, and he figured it would get better in time. Instead, it got worse. And now his wife, Ree, was bugging him to see a healer already, but he didn't really have time, and besides, the place would fall apart without him. At least that was what he kept telling himself. It wasn't really so much the case anymore. When Brisbane was the captain, the office was a disorderly mess, but Osric had brought his military efficiency to the running of the castle guard. Newcastle appreciated it. He really did, especially since it made his life easier. He didn't move as fast as he used to since he started having problems with his knees, after all. Today, he'd been busy, processing the paperwork on poor Quain's departure. Newcastle hadn't really expected the boy to be able to handle being a detective, and it was his considered opinion that it had just been dumb luck that enabled Quain to figure out who hijacked that boat. But nobody ever listened to Newcastle's opinions. They just had him handle the paperwork and keep track of assignments and fetch tea for detectives when wizards hit them with teleport spells that made them throw up. He was okay with that. Besides, 2 more years and he could retire with a full pension. Then maybe he could take Ree on that cruise. Danthres and Ian came into the squad room from one of the interview rooms just as he filed the last of Quain's paperwork with Ep. The poor kid hadn't even been in the guard long enough to earn any kind of pension, so he was going out into Cliff's End with nothing but whatever he'd saved. He made a mental note to check up on the boy, which he always did when someone left the guard. Someday he'd actually check up on someone. Cameron gave up his accomplices, Danthres said. He hired a dwarf and a human to start the fight so he could kill Gava. She shook her head. He wasn't even sorry that he killed her. Yeah, well, what do you expect? We were at war with the Elf Queen for so long, nobody thinks life means nothing. What a ridiculous statement. Kiss my ass. Newcastle shook his head. You two do nothing but argue. Ian grinned. Not anymore. As of this confession, I'm done with you, Danthres. Except for the paperwork. Newcastle said quickly. Yeah. Sighing, Newcastle went over to the kitchen to see if there were any pastries left. Ree was more likely to convince him to go to the healer than Ian was to get his paperwork done in a timely manner. Osric then stuck his head out of his office and bellowed, Newcastle! My office! Again, Newcastle sighed. It was never good when the captain bellowed your name followed by my office. It usually meant an unpleasant conversation. Of course, at least Osric was good enough to give you fair warning that it was going to be unpleasant. Brisbane never gave any indication that he was going to tear you a new one until you were already in the room. To Newcastle's relief, Osric didn't close the door, so it wasn't going to be that kind of talk. Once he sat down in his chair, and Newcastle parked himself in the guest chair, the captain said, We need to bring in a new detective. Newcastle nodded, not sure where Osric was going with this. The problem, the captain continued as he took out his dagger, is that nobody's ready yet. There are some promising guards, but nobody's who's as ready as Sergeant Lorenz thought Quain was, and he couldn't handle it either. Speaking very tentatively, Newcastle asked, Can I make a suggestion? That's why I brought you in here, Newcastle. Osric started sharpening his dagger, which did nothing to alter Newcastle's tentativeness. I think we should just let Danthres work on her own. No. Newcastle frowned. Sir, No. You can't solve crimes by yourself. You let yourself get caught up in a pet theory and pursue it to the detriment of other possibilities. It's too easy to do if you're working alone. Plus, the interviewing of witnesses and suspects takes twice the time with one detective. He shook his head. Besides, if Danthres has to deal with people by herself, Either she or the people she deals with, or both, will be dead before too long. Someone needs to be a calming influence on her. I'm not sure that's entirely possible, sir. Yeah, well, we have to at least... Whatever it is they had to do, Newcastle would never know, as they were interrupted by a bright light that heralded the sudden appearance of an older human in their midst, wearing blue robes and carrying a stern expression. Newcastle had to blink spots away from his eyes after the light burst. "Captain Osric, the Brotherhood of Wizards requires your assistance." Osric rose to his feet, pointing his dagger at the wizard. "The Brotherhood of Wizards should keep out of my damned office when I'm having a meeting." "Your meeting can wait," the wizard said. "I am Mike Doherty, the representative for the Brotherhood for this region." "Oh, I'm glad you're here," Osric said with what Newcastle could tell was utterly false sincerity. "Lord Albin wishes to speak to you about the manner in which you summarily dismissed the officers in his castle guard." "There is no time for such trivialities." "I doubt, sir," and now Osric was waving the dagger about, "that Lord Albin considers it trivial. I doubt King Marcus and Queen Marta would either. It is trivial by comparison to this. Another wizard has been killed. And, against, I might add, my own recommendation, the Brotherhood has requested that your castle guard investigate this murder, as it appears to have been committed by the same perpetrator as Finnert. The second wizard also owned a shop. His throat was also cut, and his body was also left in front of it. Does that mean you'll permit us to properly investigate Finnert's murder as well?" Doherty let out a very long sigh. "Yes, we will permit your detectives to examine Finnert's shop. However, it must be supervised by the new manager, who has purchased the location from the Brotherhood following Finnert's death. And that's fine. I'll have Lieutenant Tresyllione—" "No!" Osric scowled. "Excuse me?" "Neither Lieutenant Tresyllione nor Lieutenant Ian may be the lead investigator in this case. We have examined their records, and the former is too inexperienced, the latter with a troubling record. We are not enthralled with Lieutenants Carriston or Nail either. And Lieutenant Linder's casework also leaves quite a bit to be desired." Newcastle winced. He had just listed all the detectives. "As it happens, we have a new hire in the squad who is starting tomorrow," Osric said. Somehow, Newcastle managed to restrain himself from gaping at his captain. Bluffing a wizard could not possibly have been a good idea. "We will need to examine this man's record. He doesn't have one." Doherty frowned and started to speak, but Osric kept going. "In Cliff's End. He served with me in the army when we fought the Elf Queen, and he helped me develop the strategy that won the day at the Nemerian Wastes." At that, Doherty blinked. "He was your aide?" "Absolutely. Finest soldier who ever served under me, with one of the keenest minds I've ever encountered. He will handle the investigation." "What is this guard's name?" "Lieutenant Torin van Wyvald." "From Miverin?" "Yes." Doherty nodded approvingly. "Oh, very well. If he's from Miverin, he must be a very thoughtful individual. We have preserved the body and the shop with a stasis spell, which will only last a day. It is Court's Spell Emporium on Boulder Pass." Newcastle blinked. "The wizard who died is Tam Court?" Doherty stared at Newcastle as if only noticing he was even in the room for the first time. "Yes. Why?" He was a witness in a recent case we had," Newcastle said quietly. "The murder of a woman named Gava in the Stone Kobold." A look of distaste came over Doherty at that. "Yes, Court was fond of such establishments. I always thought he'd be killed in one of them. I never imagined he would be killed in his own shop." He turned to Osric. "Your Lieutenant Van Wyvald will report to the shop first thing in the morning?" Osric nodded. "Absolutely." "Good." With that, Doherty gestured and disappeared in a flash of light. Before Osric could say anything, Newcastle said, "I'll send someone to fetch Mr. Van Wyvald away. He's staying at the Flying Unicorn." Newcastle nodded and got to his feet even as Osric sat down and went back to sharpening his dagger. He hesitated before moving to the door. "Captain, what if Van Wyvald doesn't take the job?" "He'll take it," Osric spoke with confidence. "What if he does take it?" Now Osric frowned. "I beg your pardon." "Well, every detective in there came up through the ranks. They may resent someone being given a lieutenant's cloak without earning it." Osric stood back up, pointing at Newcastle with his dagger. "Torin van Wyvald was one of the only reasons why we even survived the Nemerian Wastes. I exaggerated to Doherty about his helping with the strategy there because I needed to convince him. But Ben Wyvald's quick thinking and observational abilities were a big part of why the 17th lived through that winter. Trust me, he's done his time in the trenches, just not the trenches here. I understand, Captain, but... After Newcastle's hesitation went on for a second, Osric prompted him. But what? I'm not the one you have to convince, sir. Instead of responding, Osric just sat back down and picked up the sharpening stone. Which, Newcastle figured, was answer enough. Rubbing his jaw, he went out into the squad room on aching knees to find someone to fetch their new detective. Danthres. The last thing Danthres expected to see when she walked into the squad room to start her shift was the primary witness in the Gava murder. She especially didn't expect to see him wearing guard armor with a griffin crest and wearing a brown cloak. He was seated at Quain's old desk. Nobody else was in the squad room, which wasn't much of a surprise. The shift was just starting, and the only detective other than Danthres who had ever come in on time in the past 6 months was Quain. Staring at Torin Ben Wyvald, she said without preamble, "You do know that impersonating a guard is a crime in this city-state, yes?" Rising from the chair, Ben Wyvald smiled. "A pleasure to see you again as well, Lieutenant Tresyllione." Osric and Newcastle came in from the former's office. "Ah, good, Tresyllione, you're here. I believe you've already met your new partner." Danthres's gray eyes widened. She didn't even understand what Ben Wyvald was doing in guard armor. Now she was supposed to be partnered with him? Speaking slowly, she said, "I've met Mr. Ben Wyvald, yes, as a witness in a case that hasn't even gone before the magistrate. And he still will be." Osric walked toward the two of them. "Only he'll be testifying as a lieutenant in the castle guard, which would make him a much more impressive witness." While Danthres had to concede that the magistrate tended to put more stock in statements made by the castle guard and the nobility than he did ordinary citizens of the domain, it didn't explain what this idiot was doing as a lieutenant. Is this some kind of joke? Osric glared at her with his one good eye. "Have you ever known me to joke, Tresyllione?" "No, sir," Danthres said. "Your humorlessness is legendary." That prompted a snort from Ben Wyvald. The captain turned his glare to Torin, and then said, "You two are to report to Court's Spell Emporium on Boulder Pass." Ben Wyvald stood and immediately winced. With a grin, Danthres asked, "The boots, right?" "Yes." He sounded surprised. "Usually takes at least a month to break the damn things in. Not that I expect you to last that long." "Your confidence is touching." "The shop," Osric said, "and Court's body are being preserved with a stasis spell by the Brotherhood until you two arrive." Both Danthres and her new partner's jaws dropped at that. The latter said, "Court is dead?" Nodding, Osric said, "His throat was cut, same as Finnert. This time the Brotherhood has specifically asked for our help." Danthres couldn't believe it. One wizard being killed by so mundane a manner as having his throat cut was difficult to credit. Two was almost impossible. Then Osric said, "Also, Ben Wyvald is to be the lead investigator on this, at least when you're in the presence of any mages." "What?" Now Danthres was convinced that this had to be a joke. Holding up a hand, Osric sounded aggravated when he explained. "It was the only way to get the Brotherhood to agree to an investigation at all. They were not happy with your behavior at Finnert's murder scene, nor with how much experience—" "What's wrong with my experience?" Danthres blurted out. She wasn't surprised that a wizard would think poorly of her behavior at the scene, though the Brotherhood should have had more of an issue with Ian. Then again, at least she was on the case, which Ian wasn't, so she supposed that counted for something. "The issue with your experience is that there's not enough of it." She pointed at Ben Wyvald. "It's 1.5 years more than he's had." "She has a point, sir," Ben Wyvald said. "I think it would make more sense." Osric's scowl was almost glowing. "I can assure both of you that right now I have very minimal interest in what either of you think. Now get to Boulder Pass." Danthres was unhappy, but based on Osric's attitude, this was as much politics as anything. However, she did have one last question. "Will we also be able to look at Finnert's shop?" Nodding, Osric said, "The shop is remaining closed, and 2 guards from Dragon are keeping an eye on it until you get there. But go to Court's first. Any questions? No? Good." With that, Osric turned go back into his office. With a sigh, Danthres turned to leave, not bothering to see if Ben Wyvald came with her. As it happened, he did, though he walked gingerly thanks to his new boots. I see Osric is still pretending to ask if anyone has any questions without actually allowing time to ask them. He used to do that in the army as well. Not looking at her partner, she said, "Don't even try to make small talk with me. I don't care to get to know you, and I'm still not sure I entirely trust you." "Why ever not?" He sounded surprised at that. Now she did look at him. "You need to ask that? You were my prime suspect in Gava's murder until Cameron confessed, and I'm still not entirely convinced you didn't have something to do with it." "Why is that?" he asked defensively. Smiling wryly as they exited through the portcullis, Danthres said, "Because in the year and a half I've been with the guard, I have never had a single witness provide as much detail about a crime as you did who wasn't intimately involved with the crime." Shrugging, Ben Wyvald said, "I was trained to be observant." "In Miverin?" "Yes. I always believed that place was a myth." At that, Ben Wyvald grinned. "That puts you in company with the vast majority of the people I've met outside Miverin." Staring at his smile, Danthres shook her head. "On the other hand, it probably is everything people say it is if you came from there with such perfect teeth." Laughing, Ben Wyvald said, "Indeed. Listen, Lieutenant, I understand that you do not wish me to be here. I must confess to being rather stunned that Osric offered me the job, but I was hardly in a position to decline the opportunity." "Oh, I don't blame you for taking the job. Worry not, though. I'm sure I'll find plenty to blame you for as we proceed, which won't be for long." "That's the second time you've said that. What makes you think I won't last?" 6 months of experience. I'm hoping that once you, Osric's pet soldier, runs screaming from the castle, the captain will finally see the wisdom of allowing me to work alone." They were proceeding down Mirko Way, moving past the mansions of Unicorn Precinct. "I'm hardly Osric's pet anything," Ben Wyvald said. "And you might be underestimating me." Danthres would have expected him to be more exasperated, or annoyed, or angry, but no, he was speaking in the same pleasant tone he'd been using every time she talked to him. It was starting to seriously piss her off. She whirled on him. "You're not a detective. You're not even a member of the guard. You're a friend of the captain who got lucky, and it's my considered opinion that you'll wash out of here faster than Quain did, and Quain was the biggest idiot I've ever been partnered with. This job is important, Ben Wyvald. We speak for people who can't speak for themselves." And then she turned, and he continued to stride down Mirko Way. "Interesting," Ben Wyvald said. He was able to keep up with her stride, which she found annoying. "Hadn't really thought about the job in that way, but then I've had very little time to think of it at all, as Osric came to me last night and had me come to the castle and be fitted for this ill-fitting armor." Danthres couldn't help but smile at that. It had taken Lady Mirka's armorers 7 tries to get hers to fit properly. Ben Wyvald continued. "I came to Cliff's End because I had nowhere else to go. Went to Osric simply because he was someone I knew. I never imagined he'd offer me a job." For a moment, Danthres was bitterly amused that Ben Wyvald came to Cliff's End for the same reason she did. But the moment passed, as most people came here for that reason. They were neither of them unique in that. They passed Oak Way, and Ben Wyvald then asked, "We're now in Dragon Precinct, yes?" "Yes," Danthres said simply. The conversation was only irritating her more, and she was at the point where she wanted to keep it brief. They turned onto Boulder Pass. A crowd was gathered near the magic shop, but it was a smaller one than what she saw around Finnert's place. Since Quartz was surrounded by a glowing blue sphere, Danthres couldn't bring herself to be overly shocked that people were gaping. As soon as they approached, the same wizard who had kicked them out of Finnert's appeared suddenly in a flash of light. "About time you arrived," he said without preamble. "The spell was only going to last another hour." With a gesture, the blue sphere dissipated, prompting a gasp from the onlookers. One of them stepped forward, moving closer to Doherty. The wizard said, "Ah, good, you're here. This is Jan. He's the manager of the shop. He will handle whatever you need. I have other, more important business to attend to." With that, he gestured and disappeared in a flash of light. Danthres had been hoping the wizard would stick around. Disappointed, she turned to Jan, a dwarf wearing a bright yellow tunic that almost blinded Danthres. "Where's the body?"
"It was discovered on the street," the dwarf said, "though we removed it in short order."
She sighed. "You really shouldn't have done that. It'll be a great deal more difficult to ascertain who killed Court if his body's been moved." However, Ben Wyvald was peering at the dirt road. While the main thoroughfares of Cliff's End were cobblestones, Side streets like this were still glorified pathways, and said, "It doesn't matter. This isn't where Court was killed." Danthres couldn't believe this. "Excuse me?" Ignoring her, Ben Wyvald looked at Jan, pointing at a spot in the dirt. "This is where you found the body, yes?" Sounding impressed, Jan said,
"Yes, Lieutenant, that is precisely where his body was. How are you aware of that?"
"Well, there's a body-shaped impression in the dirt. The impression is exactly the same size as a person's body, without any variance, which means he didn't fall, and that usually leaves an impression that does not perfectly conform to a person's shape. When people fall, they twitch, or thrash about, or try to stop their fall, or do something else to pervert the shape of the impression." After blinking, Danthres stared down at where Ben Wyvald was pointing. It just looked like dirt to her. "Also," he added, "there's only one set of footprints between the door and here, heading to and from, and there's also only a little bit of blood on the ground. The body was placed here after Court was killed. If, as you say, his throat was cut, had he been murdered on this pass, there would be far more blood." Now Danthres rolled her eyes. She was almost starting to respect Ben Wyvald's observations, but now he was just parroting Ian. You don't know that." "I do, actually. Believe me. I've seen more than my share of cutthroats in my time. The blood tends to spray." He turned to Jan. "May we see the inside of the shop, please?" Jan nodded and walked toward the shop's entrance.
"Please come with me."
He glanced up at Danthres.
"You must feel very fortunate to have so knowledgeable a partner."
Danthres didn't even dignify that with a response. When she caught Ben Wyvald smiling, she glowered at him. However, the inside of the shop told them nothing more than Finnert's did. It had a similar arrangement to the other one, except the desk was along the side wall, running the length of the shop, with a doorway covered in beads leading to the rear storage. This time, Danthres went to the rear, while Ben Wyvald continued to look fruitlessly at the main floor. The back was filled with floor-to-ceiling shelves, filled to bursting with boxes, scrolls, jars, and more. She glanced at something in one of the jars that looked really disgusting and decided not to peer at it too closely. Besides, the door that went to the area behind the shop caught her eye. It was covered in blood. Leaning back, she cried out, "Ben Wyvald!" He came in a moment later. "What is it?" She pointed at the door. "Ah, yes. As I said, cutthroats tend to spray blood. But everything's in place, neatly on the shelves." Danthres shook her head. "There's no indication that there was any kind of struggle. I can't imagine a lizard would just let someone cut his throat." "Indeed." Then Ben Wyvald chuckled. "Pity, really." "What is?" Danthres was confused, as she found nothing humorous about anything that had happened since she walked into the squad room this morning. "Well, under other circumstances, we could ask Court to cast the inanimate residue spell that would peel back the scene. If Doherty ever deigns to speak to us again, perhaps we can ask him." "Perhaps." Danthres shuddered at the notion. She'd already dealt with wizards more in the last week than she ever expected to her entire life. Mages did not consort with the likes of her, after all. But then, wizards didn't usually get killed, either. "I believe we shall speak to him again, but until then, we've learned all we can from this scene." "Have we? I don't see that we've learned much of anything beyond the fact that Court was killed here and taken outside." Now Danthres grinned, looking forward to showing this neophyte how detective work was done. "We know that he was killed by someone he knew and trusted. It's not possible for a wizard to be caught unawares by a stranger, so he must have allowed his killer to get very close to him. The killer then wanted everyone to know that he'd killed a wizard, so he left the body outside in front of the wizard's shop, where it was guaranteed to be seen in very short order. Our killer is someone who is bold, a friend of both victims, and who has something to gain by their very public deaths." Nodding, Ben Wyvald said, "Oh, yes. I can see that, thank you." To Danthres' annoyance, he sounded completely sincere. Grumbling, she turned on Jan. "We need to investigate the other store, but we may need to come back here, so do not open up just yet." Glancing at Ben Wyvald, she said, "We'll need to contact the manager at Finnert's store."
"Oh, that's easy enough,"
Jan said.
"I'm the manager of both stores."
Danthres whirled on him. "Really? When did that happen?"
"Well, just last week, actually." "Why?"
To be continued. We'll have part 4 tomorrow. Please subscribe to the channel so you can be alerted when that happens, and when more readings happen after this. Check me out online at DeCandido.net, DeCandido.wordpress.com, and Patreon.com/KRAD. And please stay safe. I'll see you tomorrow.